Chilling Christmas encounter. It was a cold December night, just a week before Christmas. My family has a tradition of spending the holidays at our summer house in the Hamptons, New York. Unlike the bustling summers, the Hamptons were eerily quiet this time of year, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breathing. Most houses in the area were owned by wealthy families who only visited during the summer, leaving the neighborhood nearly abandoned in winter. This year, my dad and I arrived first. My mom and sister had work commitments and wouldn't join us until the following weekend. Dad, being retired, and me, with school out for winter break, decided to get a head start and settle into the house. Our family house sat at the end of a secluded dead-end road, surrounded by thick trees and silence. Each of us had our own bedroom, which made it feel cozy yet a bit too quiet. As always, Dad took care of turning on the heat, water, and everything else needed after months of vacancy. Meanwhile, I stayed in my room, setting up my PS3 to lose myself in video games. The faint hum of the heater kicking on was oddly comforting. The first night passed uneventfully. A heavy snowstorm rolled in, blanketing everything in pristine white. It was part of the reason Dad and I came early to avoid dangerous driving conditions. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was outside. Not a single car passed by, no distant hum of neighbors, just the sound of the wind whipping through the trees. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Dad moving around the kitchen. I shuffled downstairs, still groggy, to find him standing at the window, a puzzled look on his face. "When did you build the snowman?" he asked, his tone light but curious. I blinked, confused. "What snowman?" Gesturing for me to look, he pointed to the backyard. Sure enough, there it was, a snowman standing tall, its stick arms raised high, and a smiling face carved into its head. The smile was oddly angled, as if directed right at the kitchen window. "I didn't make that," I said, my stomach twisting slightly. Dad chuckled, brushing it off. "Must be the neighbor kids. Maybe they're around for the holidays after all." I nodded, but couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. Our nearest neighbors lived a few houses away, and we hadn't seen any cars or signs of life since we arrived. Who would walk through the snowstorm to build a snowman in our yard? That night, I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I lay in bed, my room illuminated by the soft glow of my PS3. The sound of gunfire and explosions from the game filled the space, distracting me from the strange snowman. But just as I was getting immersed, a loud hit my window. My heart jumped into my throat. I paused the game, listening intently. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, I slid out of bed and tiptoed to the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered outside. At first, I saw nothing but the white expanse of snow. Then, my eyes focused on something directly below my window. I froze. Another snowman stood there, its face twisted into a menacing frown. Its stick arms were pointed straight at my window, as if accusing me of something. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Dad!" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. Within moments, he was in my room, his expression alarmed. "What's wrong?" he asked. I pointed to the window, too terrified to speak. Dad looked out and frowned. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. "Stay here." He grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, leaving me trembling by the window. I watched as he shone the light on the snowman, inspecting it closely. After a few minutes, he came back inside, his face unreadable. "It's just snow," he said. "Probably another prank. I'll talk to the neighbors tomorrow." Despite his attempt to sound reassuring, I could tell he was unsettled. That night, I slept in my sister's room, unable to be alone. The image of that snowman's angry face haunted me. The next day, Dad kept his word and went to the nearest neighbors. He knocked on their door, but no one answered. Their driveway was empty, and the house looked dark and lifeless. They weren't even in town. "Maybe it's just some kids messing around," Dad said when he returned. But his tone lacked conviction. For the next few days, nothing strange happened. The snowman seemed to be a one-time occurrence, and the house felt normal again. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, my mom, sister, and grandparents had joined us. The living room was filled with laughter and warmth as we decorated the tree and exchanged stories. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a cozy glow over the room. Just as we were settling in to watch a Christmas movie, a knock echoed through the house. It wasn't the cheerful chime of the doorbell, but a slow, deliberate knock. We all froze. Who would be visiting at this hour on Christmas Eve? Dad got up, his expression serious. He approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called. There was a pause before a voice answered. "Please let me in. I need help." The voice was muffled, but had a strange, strained quality to it. It didn't sound right. "What's wrong?" Dad asked, his tone firm. "I have no one to spend Christmas with," the voice said. "Please help me." A chill ran down my spine. Something about the way they spoke felt wrong. Too flat, too emotionless. "Leave now, or we'll call the police," Dad said firmly. There was a long silence before the voice replied, "Okay, I'll leave. Please don't call the police." We listened as the sound of footsteps crunched through the snow, fading into the night. Dad waited a few minutes before opening the door. There was no one there, just a single set of footprints leading down the driveway and disappearing into the woods. Christmas morning, a note was taped to our door. It read, "I just wanted to have a little fun. I built the snowman for the boy in the house. I don't have anyone to spend the holiday with. I'm sorry if I scared you. We never found out who left the note." The snowman, the knock, the voice, it all seemed like the actions of someone unstable. Harmless, maybe. Or perhaps not. That Christmas taught me that even in the safety of your own home, you can never be too careful. The quiet of the Hamptons no longer felt peaceful, it felt ominous. And every time I see a snowman, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine, remembering those lifeless faces staring back at me through the window. The Christmas nightmare, it was late. The kind of late when everything feels still and quiet, like the night is holding its breath. I had been calling Nico for over an hour, but no one was answering his phone. He had left the bar earlier that evening, and now, the fear creeping up my spine seemed to confirm that something had gone horribly wrong. I had explained the situation to the driver, who had offered only one piece of advice: call the police immediately. So I did exactly that. My voice trembled as I spoke to the dispatcher, giving them all the details I could remember: the bar, the time Nico had left, and the strange woman he had gone with. Then, in a daze, I woke up my family to tell them that something was terribly wrong and Nico might be in serious trouble. We needed to act fast. Within minutes, my dad, the police, and I were all in the car, heading toward the bar where we had been earlier. The unsettling feeling that something sinister had happened tightened around my chest. It felt as though the very air around me was thick with the promise of dread. As we neared the bar, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat. It was Nico. His voice was barely a whisper, ragged and gasping for air. He was frantic, barely able to speak, but I could make out the words. I've been kidnapped. I escaped. I'm using someone else's phone. I couldn't breathe. My dad slammed the accelerator, pushing the car forward as fast as possible, toward a rough neighborhood in North Miami where Nico had told us he was hiding. When we finally found him, it was worse than I had feared. Nico's face was a bloody mess. His eyes were swollen and blackened from what looked like a brutal beating. His clothes were torn, and there was no sign of his wallet, phone, or keys. He was a wreck, shaking, broken, and disoriented. He told us what had happened, each word dripping with terror. After leaving the bar with the woman, Nico had thought he was just heading to a ride-sharing pickup point. But as they reached a secluded alley, he realized something was horribly wrong. Instead of an Uber or LWT, it was a trap. Inside the car, two men had been waiting. Without warning, they grabbed him, restraining him tightly, threatening to kill him if he made a sound. For what seemed like hours, they drove, the men murmuring to each other in the front. One of them had even called my phone, threatening to hurt Nico if he screamed. Nico's eyes welled with fresh tears as he explained how they had taken everything from him. His phone, his wallet, his keys all gone in an instant. But when the car stopped, something clicked. Nico knew this was his only chance. With a burst of adrenaline, he broke free, escaping the car and bolting down the street, leaving the men behind. The car sped off into the night, disappearing into the shadows. He was certain they had planned to kill him, to dump his body somewhere and leave no trace. He had been lucky, too lucky. Despite their efforts, the police never managed to find the woman from the bar. They didn't even get a good look at her, and the men had no masks, making it clear they weren't trying to hide their faces. It made Nico even more convinced they had planned on ending his life that night. The whole ordeal ruined our holiday weekend, but at least Nico was alive. We were all shaken, but thankful. It could have been so much worse. But then, on Christmas night, things took an even darker turn. It was a few days later, and we had finally settled in for a quiet night. We had all gathered together at my brother George's house. It was our first Christmas there, and we were all excited to host the family. The house felt warm and festive, filled with the sound of Christmas music and the smells of a holiday feast. But by the time night came, everything had changed. We were all asleep when Nico's scream echoed through the house in the middle of the night. It was piercing, full of terror. "She's in the house," he cried. I rushed to his room, heart pounding. I shook him awake, pulling him from whatever nightmare had him so rattled. He was covered in sweat, his face pale with fear. But it was his words, his voice so shaky and frantic, that sent a chill down my spine. That woman, the one with the creepy smile. I couldn't shake her from my mind. Even now, the memory of her face haunted me. I didn't sleep much that night, keeping one eye open as I lay in bed, hoping the night's terror was nothing more than a bad dream. A few years before, George and I had bought the small house where we were all staying. It was a modest place, but we were proud of it. This was our first Christmas in the house, and we had invited the entire family to celebrate. It was meant to be a happy occasion, but the night had already taken an unsettling turn. The family had gathered, and the evening had gone well. My sister and her family had come early to help with the preparations, bringing their dog Mika along, as they had planned to stay overnight. Everyone else had arrived just in time for dinner. My aunt and uncle, cousin, and even our parents were there, and it was a rare, joyful occasion when we could all be together. But as the night wore on, things took a darker turn. After dinner, as we gathered in the living room with a glass of wine, the conversation shifted to a much darker topic. We talked about the murders that had been happening nearby. Bodies had been found in the woods just outside town. The conversation quickly became tense, but our mother and sister insisted we stop for the sake of the kids, who were already asleep. The night seemed to return to normal as the clock ticked on. Family members slowly filtered out, leaving only the core group behind. George, me, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. The kids went to bed, and the adults stayed up drinking and chatting, trying to get back to the cheerful mood the evening had begun with. At around 10 p.m., my girlfriend arrived to join me for the rest of the evening. Her family had already left, and she was ready to spend Christmas night with me. As the night wore on, the conversation moved from casual to a more serious tone. It wasn't long before we decided to call it a night and head to bed. That's when it happened. I woke up to my girlfriend shaking me awake. The room was dark, the kind of dark where everything feels suffocating. The clock beside my bed read 2 a.m. My groggy mind tried to focus, asking her what was wrong. She whispered one word, "Listen." I heard it deep, menacing growls from Mika. The dog was standing in the hallway, her low growl vibrating through the house. I got up to check what was going on. That's when I saw it. The back door to the house was wide open, a cold draft blowing through the room. Mika stood near the door, her eyes fixed on the dark yard outside. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. I scanned the yard, but there was no one there, just darkness. As I stood there, a voice called my name, distant but unmistakable. It was George's voice. Confused and anxious, I rushed back to my room, quickly put on my coat and shoes, and grabbed a flashlight. The snow was falling lightly, dusting the ground in a layer of white. I followed the footprints, which led from the back door toward the woods. "George," I called, my voice cutting through the still air. His voice answered back, distant but clear. I called again, following the trail deeper into the woods, but the footprints began to fade. The more I walked, the less clear the trail became. Soon, they were completely gone. I shouted again, "Where are you? What's wrong?" The voice responded again, but it didn't sound like George anymore. Each time it answered, it was farther away, as though George was moving deeper into the woods. Something didn't feel right. Panic gripped me. I tried calling George's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I was completely alone in the woods, the eerie silence pressing in on me. Suddenly, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but when I saw it was my girlfriend, I picked up. "Chet, George is in his bedroom right now," she said. Confusion flooded me. I asked her to check if my sister's husband was still on the pull-out couch. She confirmed he was. I froze. My heart dropped as the realization hit me. I wasn't hearing George in the woods. It wasn't his voice at all. Panic surged. I turned and ran back toward the house, my mind racing. Whatever was out there, whatever was mimicking George's voice, was still lurking in the dark. When I finally made it back to the house, the others were awake. Their faces were pale, full of fear. I told them everything: Mika's growling, the open door, the footprints, and the voice that had called my name from deep in the woods. We debated calling the police, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing they could do. The officer asked a few questions, but left without much comment, telling us to call if anything else happened. But nothing else did. The rest of the night passed in an uneasy silence, and I could never shake the feeling that whatever happened that night had something to do with the murders in our area. The woods, that place where I had ventured alone, still haunt me. I can't bring myself to go anywhere near them after dark. And now every time I hear Mika growl in the distance, I wonder, what if something from that night is still out there watching me